주시옵소서. 손 들고 옵니다. 주 나를 박대하시면 나 어디가 내 죄를 씻기 위하여 피 흘려 주시니 고되게 하는 마음으로 주 앞에 옵니다. 하나님 말씀 창세기 4장 16절 17장을 합독합니다. 시작. 하나님이 가인이 여호와의 앞을 떠나 나가 에덴 동편 노 땅에 거했더니 아내와 동침하니 그가 잉태하여 에녹을 낳은지라. 가인이 성을 쌓고 그 아들의 이름으로 성을 이름하여 에녹이라 하였더라. 아멘. 창세기 4장에서 하나님 앞을 떠난 가인은 수천 년이 지난 지금에 이르러서 적어도 예수님이 오신 이후로는 우리가 내 모습을 가인에다가 부착시키고 내 가족, 정말 이 땅에 있는 동안에 가장 귀하다고 여기진 관계를 맺은 사람 한 사람은 하나님 앞에 돌아온 자리로서, 예수님이 오시기 때문에 누구나 가능한 하나님 앞에 돌아온 자리로서 우리가 부여할 수 있는 그런 입술의 고백이 있어야 됩니다. 성경에 여호와 앞을 떠났다 그래갖고 내가 하나님 앞에 떠난 그 자리에 기록된 그 흔적으로 그대로 있다는 것은요, 이거는 안 맞는 거예요. 왜냐? 하나님께서 하나님 앞을 떠난 자들을 불러 모으기 위해서 이 땅에 예수님으로서 직접 이 땅에 오신 사건이요, 2000년 전에 있었어요. 그 하나님께서 다시 오신다고 그랬는데, 오신 예수님에 대한 그 믿음을 하나님 앞에 떠났다가 다시 돌아오는 그 일을 이루기 위해서 이 땅에 오신 그 하나님에 대한 고백을 하지 않고서 어느 누가 감히 예수님 앞에 달려갈 수 있는 인간이 있을 수 있나요? 하나님이 오시는데 어느 인간이 감히 창조주 하나님 앞에 달려갈 수 있을까? 여호와 앞을 떠났다가 돌아온 이 어떤 경험을요, 코에 숨을 쉬고 있는 동안에 하지 않은 자는 절대로 단정코 우리는 단언코 그 자리에 갈 수 없습니다. 그런 사람들 중에서 누가 있느냐? 이 땅에 있는 존재에서 하나님 앞에서 돌아온 자기의 모습을 살피는데 살피지 말라고, 하나님 앞에 떠나지 않았다고 주장하는 그 주장이 바로 590년부터 나타나는 이 교황령이 보는 거예요. 교황제도가 이때부터 형성되어서 2012년까지로서 약 한 1500년간 사탄은 인간이, 우리가 사탄의 창세기 3장에도 그렇지만 하나님 앞에 죽지 않는다, 하나님의 말씀에 죽는다 그랬는데 죽지 않는다, 죽지 않는다고 이야기해요. 죽지 않는다고. 마찬가지 여호와 앞을 떠나서 돌아오게 만드시는 하나님, 예수 하나님께서 이 땅에 오셨는데 우리가 죄 안 지었다. 그리고 자기가 교황령 이후로 교황은요, 자기를 하나님. 그래서 인류를요, 2012년 현재로 볼 때요, 모든 인류에게 돌이킬 수 없는, 회복이 불가능한 상태로 지금 타락해 있는 거예요. 여기는 이제 다시 하나님께서 다시 오실 이유가 없는 거예요. 2000년 전에 한번 오셔갖고 인간을 구원의 길로 분명히 길을 보여줬는데, 돌아올 수 있는 길을 보여줬는데, 그 인간이 예수 그리스도를 이 땅에 오신 하나님으로서 받아들이지 아니하고 인간 예수로, 자기가 하나님이고 교황이 하나님이고 예수님은 그야말로 불완전한 인물을 완수한, 불완성한, 불완성시킨 임무자로서 예수님을 인간으로서 떨어뜨린 거예요. 인간이 하나님의 자리에 있다 보니까 모든 인간들이 이를 추정하다 보니까 전부 다 멸망의 길로 지금 들어서 있는 것이 2012년입니다. 이런 데에 항상 이 인류 역사에서 우리가 나타낼 수 있는 내용은 이런 지경에 이르렀는데 성경에 있는 대로 이스라엘 자손들은 도대체 이때는 교황령이 나타날 때는 뭘 했으며 이때는 뭘 했느냐는 뭘 하느냐는 거지. 이걸 우리가 한번 생각해 볼 수 있습니다. 그들에게만 책임이 있는 건 아니지만 아무튼 여기에서 교황령이 나타날 때는 이스라엘은 뭐 했느냐, 또 여기 마지막 2012년에서 이스라엘은 뭐 했느냐. 오늘은 이 문제에 대한 내용을 아마 생각할 수 있도록 한번 동영상을 한번 들어보겠습니다. 브래드TV인데 브래드TV에서 했는데 이스라엘이 세계 최초로 3차 백신을 접종을 시작했다 하는 이 의미. 이스라엘은 해서 안 되는 거죠. 세계 최초가 아니고 제일 나중에 해야 될 나라인데 세계 최초로 지금 3차 백신을 접종을 시작했다. 여러 가지 그 뉴스 중에서 하나입니다. 한번 전체를 한번 들어보시고 590년에 교황령이 시작될 때 이스라엘, 그리고 지금 2012년 인류 종말 시대에 이스라엘에 그 기능이 지금 여기에서 어떻게 나타나고 있는가 한번 살펴보기를 바랍니다.
This week on Jerusalem Dateline, Israel becomes the first country to administer a third vaccine dose against COVID-19. Will it be effective? And a look at how Israel regained the land the world calls the West Bank, that the Bible calls Judea and Samaria. And archaeologists uncover Jerusalem's ancient city wall from 3,000 years ago. All this and more this week on Jerusalem Dateline. Hello and welcome to this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Chris Mitchell. Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett announced Israel will be the first country in the world to begin a third COVID vaccination.
The decision was based on considerable research and analysis, as well as the rise in risk of the Delta variant wave. Israel has already vaccinated 2,000 immunosuppressed people with a third dose with no severe adverse events. And now we're rolling out a national third dose campaign.
The decision comes as cases of the so-called Delta variant have increased, even though the majority of Israelis have received 2 doses of the Pfizer vaccine. Given the rise in new cases, Bennett on July 22nd delivered this message to non-vaccinated Israelis.
Dear citizens, those who refuse vaccines are endangering their health, those around them, and the freedom of every Israeli citizen. They're endangering our freedom to work, the freedom of our children to learn, and the freedom to hold celebrations with the family.
Bennett warned that beginning August 8th, unvaccinated Israelis will be barred from any event with more than 100 people unless they bring a negative COVID test done at their expense. Following Bennett's decision, dozens of Israelis protested outside his home.
The idea of our Prime Minister to force all of us to be vaccinated as soon as possible, it doesn't give us the right of our body. I need to decide whether I want to be vaccinated or not. It's my right. It's my basic right. And they don't care about that. Not at all.
Even though Israel has led the world in vaccinations, new COVID cases have risen dramatically in the past month. Just a few weeks ago, Israel had lifted almost all of its COVID restrictions. Because of the rise in cases, few groups have been allowed into Israel. The rabbis from North America visited recently on a mission to support the Jewish state, as well as meet with Israel's new leaders and understand the new developments in the country. CBN Middle East correspondent Julie Stahl has that story.
These rabbis and Jewish educational leaders have been to Israel many times, but this is their first trip back in 18 months since the COVID-19 pandemic hit. Organized by the Mizrahi Religious Zionists of America, they believe God promised the land of Israel, including Judea and Samaria, to the Jewish people.
We represent all of our communities in America, and we felt it was important as leaders, to come as a group and to be able to bring messages back to our communities about what's going on here.
But we haven't had the opportunity to visit our homeland, our ancestral homeland, the state of Israel. It is a solidarity mission, and I'm happy to come to be with the people of Israel.
The experience this time has been fascinating because we've had the opportunity to meet with political leadership, with rabbinic leadership, to see places we never saw before, even though all of us have been to Israel so many times.
During COVID, Israel finally elected a new government, one that includes factions who don't support Israel's claim over the biblical heartland of Judea and Samaria, also known as the occupied West Bank. The Israeli claim to that land is a subject of particular interest to the group, which met several Knesset members representing a wide range of opinions.
Meeting people is the key. Encountering relationships is everything. Reading the media, understanding that this government was certainly going to be different than previous governments.
Rabbi Ari Rakoff, Executive Vice President of Mizrahi Religious Zionists of America, said both Prime Minister Naftali Bennett and President Isaac Herzog were educated in religious Zionist schools in the U.S.
We feel like we really had a chance during this trip to just understand the issues better and have a dialogue with them. What happens, happens. That's in God's hands. We pray for the governments.
It was wonderful to have an open dialogue with so many people and who were just so passionate. This is true democracy.
Change is always complicated, and it can very often be very good. And we're hoping that we'll be able to overcome the complications and reach the point of good with the new government.
They visited Israeli Gaza border communities targeted by more than 4,000 rockets during the 11-day Israel-Hamas war in May, and traveled to the city of Lod, where 11 synagogues were burned during the worst violence between Jews and Arabs in Israel in decades.
Lod was very painful because it was a community which everyone had such great dreams of, how Arabs and Israelis could live together in peace, and how we thought they were living together in peace, and all of a sudden, in the blink of an eye, violence erupted that was so reminiscent of the violence pre-state and the violence of 1929.
When you spoke to the residents, you sensed the trauma that the people are going through. So I actually asked one of the residents, so what's the plan going forward? And she said, I don't know.
CBN News accompanied the group on their trip through the biblical heartland of Samaria. They met with Davidi Ben-Zion, deputy head of the Samaria Regional Council.
We're in a complicated time. In Judea and Samaria, and specifically in Samaria, the strong connection between us to our brothers, to our friends abroad, gave us a lot of power and energy to work hard in this very important mission, the Zion mission to make more and more settlement in Shomron today.
Ben-Zion says they face two challenges today: security and maintaining White House support like they had under the previous administration. Ben-Zion wants this group to be ambassadors.
It is very important to explain to the world why it's so critical for Israel that we will be strong. If we will not be strong enough here, the Arabs will attack all Israel exactly like it's happened in Gaza against Ashdod, Sderot, and Ashkelon.
And what will the religious Zionists tell their own communities back home?
We're here with solidarity. We're here to connect and to bring that message home to everyone that as soon as they can, this should be their first trip back to Israel, back home.
Julie Stahl, CBN News, Samaria.
Up next, a look at developments inside Iran and what it means for the Middle East. Last week, we reported on an historic visit of Iranians here to Israel. We talked about the aftermath of that visit and what's going on inside Iran right now with Eli Kohanim, Senior Fellow at the Center for Security Policy. Eli Cohen, thanks for joining us on Jerusalem Dateline. Great to be with you.
Great to be with you, Chris.
Last week, there was really a historic visit of some Iranian expats that came here. Tell me what happened during the trip and sort of what was the impact of it.
So, Chris, this was a delegation of Iranian Muslims coming for the first time to Israel after the 1979 Islamic Revolution in Iran. And they came because they wanted to express solidarity with Israel and the Jewish people following the Gaza conflict, which they understand is an Iranian proxy. Hamas is an Iranian proxy. Palestinian Islamic Jihad is an Iranian proxy. These terror groups are attacking Israel on behalf of the Iranian regime, and they felt that this was the moment for them to come to Israel and show their rejection of this hatred that the regime espouses.
A lot of people may think of Iran just in terms of the regime, but it's really not like that, is it? And do these men represent another point of view of Iran?
They wanted the Israeli people to understand that the Iranian people are not the same thing as the Iranian regime. And they told me they wanted to come to Israel and face-to-face tell Israelis that they love Israel. And they really support the Jewish people in the Jewish people's desire for a sovereign state and to have a Jewish state of Israel.
What impact did it have on them?
They couldn't believe that Israelis were warmly embracing them, were welcoming them into their country and into their homes. We went to an IDF army base, and these gentlemen for the first time met an Israeli soldier. A couple of the delegation were people who were born after the 1979 revolution, and so they were raised under the propaganda of the Iranian regime. What they told me was that growing up, they were told that Israeli soldiers were ruthless, soulless, killing machines with the most advanced technology. And so this was the image that they were told about Israeli soldiers. They come on this army base, they meet these 19-year-old Israeli men and women who are being so kind to them, who would cut up fruits and vegetables for this visit, who were talking to them, just buddy-buddy, and also telling them a little bit about the Hezbollah threats because we were on the border of Lebanon at the time. And so these Iranians just couldn't believe that despite all that the regime does to really threaten the Jewish state, that the Israeli soldiers and Israeli citizens warmly embraced them and welcomed them into their country.
They also talked about what's called the Cyrus Accords. It was really new to me. Tell us what the Cyrus Accords are.
Well, they wanted to pay tribute to one of the great leaders of ancient Persia, Cyrus the Great, who at the time gave the Jews the permission and the encouragement to rebuild the Second Temple here in Jerusalem. And so the Persian-Jewish relationship is an ancient one that spans thousands of years. And so they want to rekindle that ancient relationship and bring the Jewish people and the Persian, the now Iranian people back together under the banner of a Cyrus Accords peace deal.
So this comes on the heels of the Abraham Accords. If you go back 2 or 3 years, a lot of people wouldn't even have expected this to even happen. Are you feeling the same thing, that it really could happen, something like the Cyrus Accords?
We think it could happen under a free Iran. Certainly this current regime, which again espouses hatred towards America, constantly says death to America, death to Israel. This is not the regime that's going to make peace with the Israeli government. But today, right now, as we're speaking, Chris, the Iranian people are out on the streets. They're demonstrating against the regime. They're shouting, death to Khamenei, who's the supreme leader in Iran. And they're also chanting, not for Gaza, not for Lebanon, but for Iran, which means that they're rejecting the Iranian government spending the country's resources to fund these terror operations against Israel. And so there is, I think, certainly a hope for a brighter future when the Iranian people are free of this regime and can make peace with all of their neighboring countries.
Well, we hope that freedom does come to the Iranian people. Eli Cohen, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Chris.
Up next, a look at the land the world calls the West Bank, but others call Israel's biblical heartland. The Jewish founders of Ben & Jerry's ice cream say they are backing the company's decision to boycott Israeli communities in the West Bank or Judea and Samaria while still supporting the Jewish state. Trouble erupted when the company's board voted to boycott the sale of its product in the areas that Israel regained as part of the 1967 Six-Day War. Here's a story we did on the 50th anniversary of that war about that disputed territory. Much of the world calls the playgrounds these children enjoy an obstacle to peace. That's because they're in Judea and Samaria, otherwise known as the West Bank. Are we witnessing prophecy unfolding right now after the 1967 war?
Absolutely. It says that the sound of children playing in the streets will be heard once again. So you hear it, you see it.
I spoke with former Shiloh Mayor David Rubin in Shiloh, overlooking the road of the patriarchs, the highway Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob would have traveled on. Rubin told me the Six-Day War was pivotal in Israel's history. It opened the door for Jewish people to redeem the biblical heartland after 2,000 years in exile. Places like Jerusalem, home of 2 consecutive Jewish temples, Bethlehem, the birthplace of Jesus, Hebron, where Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and their wives are buried, and Shiloh, where the tabernacle stood for 369 years. They all came back into Israeli hands.
So you see 67, the Six-Day War, just like a pivot, a prophetic pivot in time and history? Oh, clearly. It says in the book of Ezekiel that the dry bones being put back together again. Israel was being put back together again as a nation. We don't have a right to Shiloh, we don't have a right to Shechem, and we don't have a right to Bethel and Jericho. We definitely don't have a right to Tel Aviv.
But not everyone saw the opportunity. It took until 1978 for Shiloh to be established, just above the site where the tabernacle had rested.
There were Israelis who were coming here trying to set up tents on the lower hills of Shiloh, and the Israeli prime minister, who was looking over his shoulder at the American president, kept sending in the army to chase them away.
Just months after the Six-Day War, Israelis established the first Jewish community in Judea, about 35 miles south of Shiloh at Kfar Etzion. Jews lived there before Israel's independence war in 1948 and were either evacuated or massacred by the Jordanians.
When this group of orphans of those who were murdered notified the Israeli government that if you don't give us the permit, we will go on without a permit. The government really couldn't stand up against orphans of those who were murdered. And so Kfar Etzion was established.
Rabbi Eliezer Waldman was one of those who helped establish the next community in ancient Hebron.
There was always a Jewish community in Hebron, even during the 2,000 years of exile until 1929, when the Arabs massacred the Jewish community here.
A small group of families rented a hotel in Hebron for the Passover Seder. Essentially, they never left.
And I believe then almost the entire population of Israel was with us. Even more than a half a year after the Six-Day War, the spirits were high among almost the entire population.
Thousands of Israeli pilgrims enter the old city of Jerusalem for solemn religious ceremonies.
All of the media was with us. Yeah, I even remember headlines, passages of the prophets hovering in the air.
After 50 years, some 430,000 Israelis live in more than 200 communities in Judea and Samaria. The number jumps to 750,000 if Eastern Jerusalem neighborhoods are included.
The growth here has been so tremendous, and as we've gotten through those 50 years after the Six-Day War and we're looking to the future, so we have this vision of a booming Shiloh once again.
50 years ago, what would this place have looked like?
Barren desert. There was nothing. It was just hills of weeds and thorns.
This road will lead to a new school for the growing population. There are 8,000 residents in the Shiloh Township. More than 2,000 of them are children who study here in Shiloh.
We learned that when Israel is not in the land, that the land lays barren. The land doesn't give its fruit. And now the land of Israel is giving of its fruit because Israel is back, and The most important fruit is what you see right here. All these children here.
Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Shiloh in Samaria. Still ahead, archaeologists uncovered Jerusalem's ancient city wall from 3,000 years ago.
You touch something, or you walk on something, or you lean against something that you know somebody did the same thing 2,600 years ago. So it's emotional.
Archaeologists excavating in Jerusalem have uncovered part of the ancient city wall from almost 3,000 years ago. The timing also came just days before the Jewish fast, marking the destruction of both the first and second Jewish temples. CBN Middle East correspondent Julie Staub shows us why that's a key part of the discovery.
Finding this part of the wall in the City of David archaeological site provides a key to understanding the First Temple era of ancient Jerusalem.
In the 60s, famous British archaeologist Kathleen Kenyon, just a few meters north of here, uncovered 30-meter section of the same wall. Then she claimed already this is the wall of Jerusalem during the time period.
Then, according to Dr. Vukosavovich, about a decade later, Israeli archaeologist Yigal Shiloh found another section further south, but a piece of the puzzle remained missing.
For a number of years, we attempted to find additional sections of this wall, and we couldn't. So much so that we started doubting the existence of this wall.
That brings us to this discovery of two more sections, which clears up the mystery.
So now we can conclusively say that, yes, the city of David, at least, had one massive wall that surrounded the city of David.
The wall behind me would have protected the ancient city of Jerusalem for about 200 years, from the 8th century BC until about 587 BC.
In 600 BC, the Babylonians besieged the city, which is described in the book of 2 Kings. The Bible says Nebuzaradan came to Jerusalem. He set fire to the temple of the Lord, the royal palace, and all the houses of Jerusalem. Every important building he burned down. The whole Babylonian army under the commander of the imperial guard broke down the walls around Jerusalem. Archaeologists found evidence of that burning just inside the wall. This part apparently wasn't destroyed, possibly because of the steep hill below it. In addition to the wall, archaeologists found artifacts indicating what life was like in the kingdom of Judah in those days.
And we found right here where I stand a bulla of a person called Tzafan, which is abbreviation of Tzefania, which we find in the Bible as well. Just a few centimeters away, and we found a Babylonian stamp seal.
The jar handles were stamped with rosettes and circles and with Lamelech, belonging to the king.
You find a really beautiful wall in so many ways. You touch something, or you walk on something, or you lean against something that you know somebody did the same thing 2,600 years ago. So it's emotional.
For now, the excavation continues as archaeologists try to understand how the nearby Gihon Spring and other sites fit together. Julie Stahl, CBN News, the City of David, Jerusalem.
That's one more discovery validating the connection of the Jewish people here in Jerusalem and the account of the Bible. Well, that's all for this edition. Thanks for joining us. Remember, you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. You can also access CBN content through our CBN News and other CBN apps.
영상물을 여기서 마칩니다만은 이 영상물의 내용도 그 진정성에 대한 걸 우리가 광고용이 아닌지 이런 것도 많이 검토를 하면서 우리가 봐야 됩니다. 즉 다시 말하면은 우리는 지금 이스라엘이라고 유대인이라고 하는 이 단어에 성경에 있는 유대인, 성경에서 나타난 이스라엘 여기에서 제한돼 가지고 우리가 지금 이스라엘을 보고 있단 말이에요. 그러나 실제로 이스라엘은 성경이 이스라엘하고는 완전히 떨어진, 그렇다고 해서 성경이 이스라엘이 없는 건 아닌데 그 이스라엘은 사실 우리가 찾아야 됩니다. 지금 그 있는 위치를요, 현재 이런 뉴스 갖고는 절대 못 찾습니다. 이런 찾는 걸 해서 우리가 대한민국의 어떤 인류 전체에서 대한민국의 위치가 하나님께서 지금 특별히 쓰시는 그런 위치가 아닌가 이렇게 볼 수 있습니다. 맞습니다. 기도드립니다.